Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on Channel 9 on WJOPLP Newburyport and on YouTube at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and this morning I am so happy to welcome Candace, Currie, and Lisa Groves, who are here to talk to us about green burials. Candace Currier witnessed both conventional and natural or green burial during her 20 years with historic Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge and Watertown. Candace believes that everyone should have the option of green or natural burial. In addition to being the clerk for the nonprofit Green Burial Massachusetts, she's president of Green Burial Massachusetts Cemetery, a nonprofit that is actively searching for land with land trust partners to establish at least one what's called conservation cemetery within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Lisa Groves chairs the Westford Cemetery Commission, which began offering green burial as an option in 2019. In addition to advocating for natural burial, she guides families wishing to care for and hold vigil for their deceased loved ones' bodies at home between the time of death and final disposition. So first of all, Candace and Lisa, thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Mary.
It's great. It's great to have you both here. Well, first, let's start with a definition of green burials. What are they and how long have they been in use?
Well, green burials are simply allowing everything that's decomposable, which is our bodies, to go back into the earth. Whether I'm wrapped in a shroud or in a plain, simple pine box, it's just allowing those things that can be, I keep saying decomposed. That's not really the word I'm looking for, but it's allowing our bodies to go back into the earth, just as nature has designed us to just add value back into the earth.
Yeah. Ashes to ashes, Candace, dust
yes,
to dust.
We can say that, yes.
and bones and bodies back to the earth from which we evolved. And so how long have green burials been in use in the United States?
So green burial is sort of a new term in the last few decades, but prior to the Civil War, all burials were green. Your cemeteries in Newburyport that date back to the 1600s, those were founded with green burials. There was no such thing as embalming. There was no need to temporarily preserve a body. So green burials can date back to our early cemeteries. And then in the 1860s or so, when we began wanting to temporarily preserve the Civil War dead soldiers from the North who died in the South, transporting them to the North, they needed some type of preservation so that the families could see their loved ones again and put them in the ground. And back then in the 1860s, the embalming fluid was arsenic. And people, that's also when the embalmer, the funeral director trade began, was during the Civil War. And you can find pictures, archived pictures of embalmers setting up their tents on the field, the war field, with upright men standing in caskets that have died. And it's quite shocking, but it was a different experience of how we treated our dead, because we still, we weren't so afraid of the dead. We were really trying to preserve them for a family photo at the other end of their travels. So in the 1860s and then into the 1940s, it became more common to also put some type of concrete liner or vault in the grave before the casket went in. So suddenly, over the course of 100 years or so, we started to extract things from the earth to protect ourselves going into the earth. And now that we're making this connection that, extracting things from the earth, whether it's fossil fuels or lime and Portland cement, isn't necessarily the proper way to give back to the earth. So we're seeing this change with the environmental movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s to live more in concert with the cycles and with the earth. So that's a long-winded way of saying the green burials have been around for a really long time.
Yeah, they have. But also the Civil War and the interest in preserving bodies for families was clearly a turning point
Mm,
in both the practice and customs, and also what then became, kind of standard practice in the United States going forward. Well, currently, Candace, how common are green or natural burials in the United States and around the world?
yes, well, the Green Burial Council is a national organization that started around 2005. So it's been almost now 20 years that there's been a movement towards greenness. And what
Yeah.
the council does is certify cemeteries for, there's three types of cemeteries they look at: hybrids, natural cemeteries, and conservation burial grounds. And so those have varying degrees of greenness that they allow. So that started in 2005. They now have hundreds, is something close to 300 to 400 cemeteries that somebody is keeping track of across the nation. It didn't start off that way in 2005. There were very few places where you could have a green burial. And strictly in Massachusetts, I can say in 2014, there were 2 cemeteries that we knew of, just 2 that we knew of that allowed
Yeah.
green burial.
Wow.
Today we have 41.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
there's been a movement here, and I don't know if how many of those cemeteries actually started doing green burials, or it's now publicized that they're doing green burials. But
Okay.
for
Yeah.
many of them, there has been a learning process.
Yeah. Well, just for background, I did some preliminary research about Newburyport, and currently, as you mentioned, our cemeteries in Newburyport are very old. And although they were, a green burial clearly was, or natural burial, what they did up till the Civil War, there currently does not appear, as far as I can tell, to be a green burial option in Newburyport immediately. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was conventional burials, which are not green. So could you talk, because as I started doing research on green burials, it was surprising to me just how not green and what kind of impact conventional burials actually have on the environment. Could you talk to us a little bit about the impact that conventional burials have on the environment and how not green they are?
Yes, thank you for that question. And, it still comes down to we're extracting things from the earth in order to put things back into the earth. So the first thing that makes conventional burials not green is that they're often going into a concrete box or a metal vault.
Mhm.
And that's because most municipal and many private cemeteries have this constant fight of, oh my God, we're running out of space, and how are we going to put more people in? And what are we going to do once we run out of space? And so by using these boxes, theoretically, the graves can be closer together,
Yeah.
and that will fit more people. So in a conventional area, you might have 1,200 burials per acre versus some of the more naturalistic areas, there could be 300 burials per acre. So it's still about space, as well as for those concrete box and those metal vaults. It helps to keep the lawn flat. So a typical municipal cemetery is going to be driving a large backhoe and many mowers perhaps over the graves. And so it has this idea of being safer. I can say there are occasions when those might dip and
Yeah.
fall in a little bit. So it's there's still a cautionary tale there to be heard. And so the concrete and the metal is one thing that makes the conventional burial conventional. Also, typically embalming is involved, and that is often up to the local Department of Health. They may require that a body be embalmed. By the time a body gets to the cemetery doesn't really know if the body's embalmed or not. So they're not opening the casket to view anything.
Oh.
They receive the casket and they put the casket or the shrouded body in the ground. So an embalming is typically a temporary preservative that's possibly required at the local Department of Health, particularly if there's going to be a public viewing for somebody. At least that's my experience out here in the Berkshires right now.
Yeah.
Also, the caskets that typically one buys at a funeral home might be from mahogany or some wood that came from rainforest that may cost more, and it had to be transported. That's the other thing about a sealed vault or a concrete vault. It's also been transported somewhere. So there's that other using fossil fuels to actually just get the thing to the cemetery. And those aren't really all that necessary. And then finally, most likely in a municipal cemetery, there are lawns. A lawn is a monoculture for the most part. And they might treat the dandelions with Roundup. They could be putting a fertilizer that's petrol-based on it. But, you know, my experience has been many people who are taking care of the grounds are more responsive to the ecology of the system, and they're using less of that, although there's still typically gas-powered mowers. But I understand that the electric-powered vehicles are getting better in terms of weed whacking around monuments, or just mowing the lawn once or every other week. So that's part of what makes up the conventional burials. And ultimately, the impact to the environment is we're extracting.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that explanation. Just to establish, to clarify then, because I used to think embalming was a legal requirement, and in the state of Massachusetts, it is not a legal requirement, but based on what you're saying, local boards of health might have their requirements, but legally in the state of Massachusetts, you do not have to have a body embalmed. You might choose to have that if you're planning on a public viewing, and burial vaults are also not required by law in the state. So I just thought it would be useful to clarify those things, because there were certainly misunderstandings that I had, Candace.
Yes, and almost all cemeteries across the state will have in their bylaws a statement that says a burial vault is required. So it's not at the state level, it's at the cemetery level. So the cemetery has a lot of power, or the town that oversees the cemetery has a lot of power and control. And I know Lisa can speak a lot to that.
Yeah, and because Lisa played a pivotal role in the town of Westford. But before we get to that, I would like to learn more about how is the body prepared, since embalming and a casket are not necessarily involved. How do you prepare the bodies for green burial, and what kinds of markers would there be then at the burial site?
Well, Lisa, why don't you take the body preparation?
Sure. So decomposition will happen. I think there's a lot of misconception about how fast it happens. And it is important to keep the body cool. I mean, if it's a hot summer day, in funeral homes, they have refrigeration as an option. Most funeral homes. What we do for a home vigil is we use what's called Techni ice. They're basically inch-thick 12 by 12 ice packs, and we put them under the body, under the torso, and with 4 ice packs under the torso, maybe 1 under the head if it's really hot, if it's summer, and perhaps if there's air conditioning, keeping the room at 65. You can, keep a body in fine condition for at least 3 days. So it's really not rocket science. Some people use dry ice, but I prefer Techni ice because it's just easier to work with.
What is that?
It's Techni ice. You can get it on Amazon.
Okay. I just never heard of it before.
Yep. So keeping the body cool. I mean, it's kind of common sense, right? I know of families who had to keep their loved one's body at home for up to 7 days. Now that's unusual with home vigils, but yeah, it can be done.
And since there is not a conventional casket, a metal casket, what kind of containers or shrouds are used generally?
Well, they need to be biodegradable.
Yeah.
So a cardboard
Mhm,
cremation box.
mhm.
Some of them come with pressed board bottoms, and that they have glues that might be considered toxic, and so you might not want to use those particular cremation
Yeah.
boxes. So you want to be careful what cremation box you might be using. A simple pine casket.
Yeah.
In Westford, we encourage people to make their own if they're so inclined,
Mhm,
using locally resourced materials.
mhm.
We don't allow nails and screws, so no
Right.
metal. You can use dowels to hold them together.
Right.
And then a shroud, typical materials might be linen, cotton, hemp, any
Mhm.
material that's natural and
That's
biodegradable.
going to biodegrade. Yeah.
Yep. And in Westford, we do require a shrouding board underneath a shrouded body, just because it helps with the transport and lowering
Sure.
process.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, speaking of the town of Westford, I know you went through a process with the town to establish green burials as an option for people. Could you talk a little bit about what the process was that you had to go through in Westford to create this option for folks?
Sure. So back in January of 2018, Candace actually came and spoke at our library. She was invited by one of our residents who was curious about green burial, and I attended that, and then met a couple other residents who were interested, and we decided that night to approach our cemetery commission the next month at their monthly meeting, which we did, and they were open to it. Some more than others, perhaps, but they were receptive and wanted more information, and suggested that we also attend a Board of Health meeting because, for obvious reasons, perhaps. And so we did attend the Board of Health meeting in that April, and we were very fortunate. I think we were fortunate in many ways in Westford because, well, we had a health director in town who did his research. He was very supportive. The Board of Health approved it unanimously. The health director's feeling was, he understands septic systems. He knows what goes into the ground, but
Yeah.
what goes into the ground with a green burial is not a problem.
Yeah.
And so we had the approval of the Board of Health, right off the bat, and then there was a process. It took 2 years from that initial meeting where Candace came and presented to have green burial official.
Yeah.
So what we had to do is change our regulations. And at the same time, the Westford Cemetery Commission was revising their rather old regulations, the entire document. So that became a lengthy process. So that took a year.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, they were kind of dragging their heels on getting it done. And I suggested that they form a green burial advisory subcommittee. And that was a really helpful process. So they appointed 7 members, which I was the chair of that committee, and we drafted the regulations for green burial. And that was quite a process because, not all green burial regulations are going to be the same in every town.
Yeah.
Every town is unique. So how do we meet our residents' needs and interests? And we tried to follow the basic standards of the Green Burial Council for a hybrid cemetery. So Candace mentioned hybrid cemeteries, natural and conservation level cemeteries. We are a hybrid cemetery. So our green burial section is within a conventional cemetery.
Okay, yeah.
So anyway, we integrated the green burial regulations into the conventional regulations, wove them in, and then in October of 2019, we had to go to town meeting to have them approved.
Yeah.
That's just how it works in Westford.
Mhm.
Not all towns
Sure.
have to go to town meeting
Right,
for their regulations. Sometimes it's the select board.
right.
But in our case, it was town meeting, approved, no problem. So it became official, but we didn't actually have a place designated yet. So a few months later, we designated 15 conventional graves as provisional green burial graves until we could figure out a more permanent situation. And then we started engaging in a process to expand one of our most active cemeteries,
Mhm.
the conventional cemetery, and we decided to integrate a green burial section within that.
Yeah.
So let's see, I have it written down, our timeline here. We had our first green burial in the provisional section in November of 2020. So it was 3 years from our start date. And then it wasn't until April of 2022 that we opened the new section, and we have 148 green burial graves in this section. And we opened in spring of 2022, and right off the bat, we had 2 green burials that May.
Oh,
Since then, we've sold 13 green burial lots.
wow.
And we've also had 1 additional green burial requested by a resident in a non-designated green section, that we were open to considering that as well. With safety kind of being safety of the equipment.
Oh, sure.
And, not wanting the heavy equipment to sink, but
Right.
anyway, so that's a lot, but.
Well, but it was doable. I mean, it took a few years, but in terms of, getting that kind of change to happen, a few years is not that long, considering all the steps that you have to go through, and you wind up with a hybrid cemetery then that just creates options for people, which strikes me as a good thing. Just curious, in the green burial section of the cemetery, are the same kind of markers allowed as in conventional burial sites?
So we allow flat natural stone markers. So granite is pretty typical. Ideally locally sourced, but we don't necessarily require that. We are fortunate that we have quarries locally. And then we're going through a process right now. We're almost there. We've pulled 2 large granite stones, or they were shaped to be rectangular. Probably in the early part of the 20th century, they were part of some old Westford structure, and they were sitting on the side of a road, not being used. And we pulled 2 of those down, and we're using those as community memorial markers in the green burial section.
Interesting.
So, I'm very excited about that.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That's a really interesting process that you described, and it strikes me as a really good outcome, Lisa.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to talk a little bit about cremation, because many people, myself included, had thought of it as a better and greener option than burial in a casket, return your ashes to the planet and so forth, enrich the soil for new life. But I've learned from your website that cremation has its downsides and isn't necessarily good for the environment. I think a lot of people share my assumptions about cremation, so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about some of the environmental impacts of cremation that people might not be aware of.
The Billy Campbell, who operates Ramsey Creek down in South Carolina, which is a conservation burial ground, he refers to cremation as the second greenest option. So you're not totally out of the park there, Mary. But, at home, we think of our ovens can go up to 500 degrees, right? Or maybe 550. Well, the cremation chambers that can burn a human body go up to about 1900 degrees, right? So more than 3 times that heat. And it powers for about 90 minutes with the body as fuel, but also natural gas as the fuel to keep these things
Yeah.
operating. So that's a long time to be using natural gas.
Yeah.
And the result are bone fragments that are then crushed so that you appear to have ashes, but you can still tell that they're bone fragments. You'll end up with 7 to 10 pounds of something from an adult
Yeah.
human body. And they're both high in sodium and really high in pH,
Mm.
much higher than trees and plants can use. So I used to think that they were just totally not valuable at all to the plants, but now with some additional research, I understand that over time, they do become more neutralized. So I don't know how well the plants are still able to uptake any of the nutrients that come from the cremated remains, but it's not as green as you originally thought it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Clearly. Yeah.
Unless perhaps you're on the bank of the Ganges River, right? And there we've got wood that's helping to cremate the body.
Right.
But that's not our culture here to be doing that.
No, it's a lot of fossil fuels, in other words, that are
Yes.
used for the cremation, and then whatever is in the ashes and the bone fragments themselves in the soil.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. And that
yeah.
and that the heat is so intense that it sort of fuses all these good nutrients together, which is why the plants can't use
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Which is really interesting. Thank you for that explanation. Well, I wanted to learn about conservation cemeteries, and I was hoping that you could tell us about what a conservation cemetery is, how it looks different and is used differently than conventional cemeteries, and about the work that you've been doing with, I think it's the Kestrel Land Trust, to forge a partnership to create a conservation cemetery in Massachusetts so that green burial could be an option for anyone who wants it.
Yes, thank you for letting me talk about conservation cemeteries. Just last month, I went up to Maine, Baldwin Hill, up in Fayette, Maine. There's a new conservation cemetery up there that's been certified by the Green Burial Council. And there was a foot of snow when I was up there, and we trudged up this road that they created on a conserved parcel. And at the top of the hill, there's this beautiful iconic view of a farmland off in the distance and a really sweet couple of acres of white pine forest. It was just
beautiful.
It was stunningly beautiful. And Kennebec Land Trust is the land trust that created that cemetery. And it works with their mission. They are land stewards, which is what a land trust is all about. They know how to stewardship land. They know how to keep open space open, or if it's agricultural land, or if it's a forest for wood products, right? The land trust folks know how to do that.
Yeah.
And so much like the Kennebec Land Trust has done up in Maine, Greenbow, Massachusetts and Kestrel Land Trust got together here in the Connecticut River Valley to find a parcel that's worthy of conservation. So that's still the first thing, it's worthy of conservation. So there's something special about the place. And we can use our bodies to help maintain the open space feel of the land, or the forested area of the land, keep it as a forest. So this is a place where we really can put our bodies back into the earth to help regenerate the soils and also protect open space. And it's a way also for the sale of the lot doesn't just go towards the creation of the endowment fund or the perpetual care fund, which we need for the long-term preservation of the cemetery, but a portion of the fee or an additional fee goes towards future land conservation entities.
Yeah.
So it's really a perfect partnership to maintain open space or green space. Maybe I should call it green space, because open space, we have this idea of a meadow, which many people want to be buried in a meadow, and that would be beautiful. But it's also able, like what Lisa is doing at Westford, they're in a pine grove. So you can maintain areas that you want to maintain. And the importance of the land trust is they're not about digging holes in the earth, right? Land trusts don't
Yeah.
really want to do that. So there's a restriction on the number of burials in a certified, Green Burial Council certified cemetery doesn't allow anything more than 300 to 400 burials per acre.
Mm,
And that's to minimize the number of holes we're digging.
yeah.
But there might be a particular forest, a particular species in the forest, a particular trail, a wetland. So all of those areas that should be protected will be protected through a conservation easement
Mm,
that's held by the land trust entity.
mhm.
And so although we're strictly working with Kestrel Land Trust right now, there's a potential for partnering with other land trusts in the Connecticut River Valley area,
Mhm.
you know, and also out of Worcester. I know Mount Grace, Hilltown, and some others might be involved, depending on where we find property. And
Yeah.
it's been a challenge because, excuse me, here in Massachusetts, we've got lots of wetlands, we've got lots of rocks, we
Yeah.
have, and lots of neighbors. So,
Yeah.
well, we didn't mention anything about the difficulty in finding space. Also happens to do, we need requirement from the local Department of Health to open up
Yeah.
a cemetery. And the Department of Environmental Protection has regional offices all across the state. They also have to approve, make sure we're not too close to a public water supply. And from the local Department of Health, it's making sure we're not too close to private wells.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so we have at least a 750-foot buffer that we need to adhere to.
Yeah.
And not all neighbors want to be near a cemetery.
Yeah.
So it's not every day that somebody establishes a new cemetery. So we're finding that, you know, we're jumping these hurdles as we reach them. And there's still a big education process involved in every single new town that we go to.
Yeah.
So we're still looking for land. We have a couple little possibilities happening right now, which I can't say too much more about,
Sure.
but our search has been ongoing and
Yeah.
it still is.
But it's a good quest and an important quest. And I understand, and you've done a good job describing both the benefits of a conservation cemetery for all of us. I mean, honestly, thinking about resting for eternity in a place with a beautiful view. And honestly, I like the idea of people hiking by, hopefully with
Yeah.
hopefully with their dogs. But I, you know, Massachusetts is, in addition to it's a small state. And there's a tremendous amount of development and demand for housing. So I totally understand the constraints that you're working within. But it sounds very hopeful that with partnering with land trusts, because it's a double benefit then in terms of conserving open space and natural habitats for wildlife as well as for plants. So it seems like there are many social goods involved in developing conservation cemeteries. And so it just sounds like a wonderful work in progress. So if people want to learn more about green burials, where can they go?
Well, we would love to have them visit the Green Burial Massachusetts website, which is greenburialma.org. And we're in the process of refreshing that website. So there might be a new one next week, right?
Okay.
But it will have all the same information. We just hope it will be easier to navigate. So that's greenburialma.org.
Right.
And you can reach out to us through that website. And we are an all volunteer 501c3. We're a nonprofit. And Lisa mentioned that, you know, I was visiting Westford. We do still go out and give presentations and Zoom presentations as well.
Wonderful.
So, yes, this has been a pleasure, Mary.
Mary,
Well, yes,
can I clarify one thing about Westford?
sure, of course.
I just want to say that we're so when we initially were deciding where we want to have the green burial section, we looked at a wooded area behind
Yeah.
an old cemetery that was considered part of the cemetery. We ended up, Candace said we're in a pine grove, but we're not actually in a pine grove. We're in Pine Grove Cemetery. That's the name of the cemetery. We're surrounded by pines, but we ended up settling on an open lawn area.
Okay,
We
yeah,
are, as part of the green burial standard, we're attempting to plant it with native grasses as much as
okay.
possible.
Yeah.
And I also want to say about the space, because Candace mentioned, the challenges of you need more space, but in our case, we're actually using less space in the natural
Ah,
burial section.
yeah,
So our graves are a little bit smaller
yeah.
in that section. So I don't want people to get scared away by thinking they need necessarily more space.
Right. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. And meadows are beautiful too. And honestly, white pines are my favorite tree. So I like the idea of a pine grove, but plenty of people love meadows too. So
Yes.
again, more options for folks. And so anyway, I just want to thank you both so much for the work that you do, creating this option for people. And also, not for nothing, thanks so much for taking time to visit the morning show and to share your knowledge. I really appreciate it. It's been really fun to talk with and to learn from both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome,
Mary.
Mary.
This has been my pleasure. So that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, take care. Be well. Bye-bye.